each scene contributes to the greater whole and is necessary. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines a scene as a sequence of continuous action in a play, film, opera, or book. I'd go a little bit further than that. In fiction writing and in novel writing, we often say, usually but not always, it is a sequence of action comprising a unique combination of setting and character. So, for example, a scene might begin when a group of characters arrives at a particular location, or when they leave a certain location. It could be when a certain character arrives on the scene or leaves. But for me, that's not really enough, because we have scenes that might move from one location to the next, or characters that come and go throughout the scene. Probably not the POV character, your point of view character, but certainly other characters might come and go. So to me, that definition also leaves us wanting. So I've come up with my own definition. My definition says a sequence of continuous action united by a common story purpose. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about the purpose of scenes, but I really want to just repeat that for a moment. A scene is a sequence of continuous action united by a common story purpose. Irrespective of whether characters come and go from the scene, irrespective of whether it moves from one place to another, what unifies the action of this scene is that it fulfills a common purpose. So what are some of the purposes? Well, what I recommend is, as you're sitting down at the start of every new scene, ask yourself, what is the purpose of this particular scene? A little story of my own here. When I was writing my book, Last of the Summer Vines, which was set in Tuscany, I did find myself, I'd done so much research into Tuscany and all the places you can go. And my editor had said that they wanted it to feel not quite like a travel log, but they wanted it to showcase Tuscany a bit. And I got a bit carried away. And I remember having these random scenes where the characters just would go off to some exciting place in Tuscany and do touristy things. And I would have to pull myself back and go, hang on a moment, what is the purpose of the scene? The purpose can't just be to showcase Tuscany. That's boring for the reader. The reader can go and pick up a nonfiction book or a Frances May's book, or, a travel guide to find out about these places. They really don't have to pick up my novel to read about visiting a certain town in Tuscany. So what is the purpose of this scene? And the minute you ask yourself that, if you find you've got a flat scene, if you that's just not really working out for you, ask yourself this, because you'll often find you're missing a purpose. And if you go back, and even if you retroactively, which I landed up having to do quite a bit with that book, is retroactively go back and give it a purpose. And if you can't, guess what? The scene has to go. So what are some of the purposes? Well, the first one is to further the plot. That's the most obvious one. It's the one we all think about when we ask why have we included this scene. It's to further the plot or the action. The next purpose could be to reveal something about your main characters, to reveal a piece of their backstory or a bit of their character arc. It can also reveal the character's GMC. For those of you who haven't attended our past webinar on GMC, that stands for Goal, Motivation, Conflict. So you can either reveal a little bit about the character's goal or their motivation of why they want that goal, or introduce a bit of conflict into why they can't get that goal. So those are all very good reasons to have a scene. The other purpose for a scene is to increase tension. Tension in the reader, tension in the story, make the story more dramatic. Those are all good reasons. And linked to that is to reinforce or raise the stakes. The stakes are, why do we care if the reader is going to get their goal? Are there high stakes? Are there low stakes? By each scene could reinforce and just raise the stakes that a little bit more. For example, if we look at a movie like The Proposal with Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds, initially the initial problem is that she needs a work visa or a visa to stay and keep her job in the United States. So she decides to marry her assistant, because then she can, as a spouse, she can legally stay. Great. There's pretty high stakes. We get that. If she gets found out, if they get found out, could be possible jail time. She could be thrown out the country. If she doesn't persuade the assistant to marry her, she could be thrown out the country and lose her job. So the stakes are pretty high already. But the story doesn't start and end there. Throughout the story, the stakes get raised. The immigration officer or inspector discovers that Ryan Reynolds' character is going off for his Grammy's birthday to Alaska. And they sort of get, the main character, Margaret, gets forced into having to go to Alaska, really outside of her comfort zone. Okay, so now we've raised the stakes there. Then she discovers that there's certain family tension, that he's got this ex-girlfriend who maybe wants him back, that maybe he's a better fit for. The family then all sort of force them into, in a nice way, but force them into getting married sooner while they're there so that Grammy can be present for the wedding. So all of these things raise the stakes. With each scene that happens, the stakes get raised. And then there are some bonus elements you can include in your scenes. World building, introducing more of the character's backstory, furthering the theme of the book, foreshadowing future elements that are coming in, and sharing information with the reader. I want you to notice that I call those bonus elements. These are not good enough, strong enough reasons on their own to have an entire scene. If you just have a scene with world building, your reader is going to fall asleep or put the book down and go off and do something more interesting. The same thing with backstory. If you've got this great big chunk of backstory, chances are the reader is going to lose interest and walk away. Foreshadowing, as clever as it is, if your whole purpose of the scene is to mirror a later scene, that's not enough. And the same thing, sharing information. We don't want an information dump. We're not reading a non-fiction book here. We don't want a whole bunch of information about Tuscany. We want to see the story build. So those are just bonus elements. And what I would recommend is each scene that you write should have at least 2 or 3 elements from that list. At least 1 or 2 of the main key elements, whether it furthers the plot, reveals something about character, increases the tension, etc., etc. Plus, possibly you could throw in a bonus element, a little bit of backstory revealed, a bit of foreshadowing, etc. So this is how you create purposeful scenes where each scene actually has a reason to be in the story and isn't going to create a snooze fest for the reader. The scene's purpose should be linked to the central story problem in order to ensure that each story is relevant. This goes back to what I said earlier about you don't want your story to feel just episodic. Episodic stories tend to not be as engaging for the reader. You might as well be writing a series of short stories about the same character rather than a novel. So how do you create that sense of unity? Well, you link the purpose to the central story problem. Whatever your core story hook is, whatever the core goal of your character was at the start of the book, that's going to be their goal throughout the entire book. That is what you want to link the story's purpose into. You want to make sure that that is furthered in each and every single scene. Then the story stays relevant. Every scene must move the story forward. If, as I've said before in the previous slide, if it doesn't do some of the certain elements on that list, it's not going to move the story forward. In fact, it's going to grind the story to halt. You can imagine an entire scene of world building is going to grind the whole story to a halt, take the reader out of the story, and then next scene you're back in, but now the reader's lost the motivation, lost the will to read. So you want to keep the story moving forward all the time. If you find that a scene that you're writing lacks energy or forward motion, readers will grow bored. And often this happens when you, as the writer, are bored. If you're feeling bored writing it, chances are the reader will grow bored reading it. So just, again, bring yourself back to this. If you're feeling like the scene is lacking energy, it's dragging, it's slow, just go back and look at that list of purposes and go, have I got a strong enough purpose in this scene? Again, if the scene feels flat, which is a little bit different from lacking energy, but if it is feeling a bit flat for you as well as the writer, give your characters actions to perform, because that generally lifts it up. And this also prevents, if you've got, for example, a dialogue heavy scene, you can imagine Sex in the City, 4 women chatting in a coffee shop about their lives. That can feel very dead to the reader. But the minute you give them action, bring in another character, have them spill tea all over the table. Obviously, you want it to be relevant to what is going on with the characters and their dynamic between them, but bring in some action and it tends to add a bit of life into the scene.